mein Gott und Richter, willst du mich auf dem Gesetze fragen, so kann ich nicht, weil mein Gewissen widerspricht, auf 1000 reines Sagen, an Seelenkräften arm und an der Liebe bloß, und meine Sünd ist schwer und übergroß, doch weil sie mich von Herzen reuen, wirst du, mein Gott und Gott, durch ein Vergebungswort mich wieder unerfreuen.
afternoon once again. So many here will have guessed that this is a cantata from Johann Sebastian Bach's cycle based on chorales. That is the cycle he composed and first performed in the year 1724-1725. We are, of course, observing the 300th anniversary of the composition and first performance of that cycle. The piece we just heard was originally heard in September 1724. So we are almost precisely at its 300th anniversary. Some characteristic features you might recognize. The same hymn is used in the first and last movements, typically, as here, a big chorus and a simple harmonization to end. The intermediate movements, whose poetry is cast as recitatives and arias, includes lines retained from the chorale, and if you had the original hymn to compare it to, you'd see that those movements are all paraphrased from the chorale where they don't quote it directly. You may not be surprised either about the topic of the gospel reading for the day, which, by the way, is the 13th Sunday after Trinity. In it, Jesus quotes the book of Deuteronomy on loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself, and offers the parable of the Good Samaritan. The chosen hymn and its paraphrase in the cantata take up the topics of that gospel reading: the law, love, comfort in distress, and with a very Lutheran emphasis on faith, and that is faith in Jesus in salvation, not on neighborly works. Yeah, very Lutheran emphasis there, not on those neighborly works called for by Deuteronomy and by Jesus, but on faith and belief in Jesus. I want to take, though, although we could go into any of those topics in great detail, I want to take a different way today into listening to this cantata. I want to talk instead about the tools Bach used to create the piece, and then turn that composition into performance. This last step, the way Bach turned a composed work into a performance, is of particular interest to us here at the Bloomington Bach Cantata Project. We model our performances on his own, and to a certain extent, we are following his steps in that process. So I have some things to show you as well as to tell you about. The starting point for Bach was, of course, the text. That means the words that you've got there in front of you. But those words were reflected, in fact, in a specific document, printed booklets called Text to the Leipzig Kirchenmusik, and they looked something like this. This is a facsimile of the little booklets that could be purchased at or outside the church by Bach's congregants that had the words for the cantata in them. They were for sale at the churches. In other cities, the music director was typically the beneficiary of any profit that might have been turned on these. We do not know what Bach's arrangement was. These hardly survive. The originals, this is of course a facsimile, the originals are exceedingly rare. Something like 10 of them survive from across Bach's entire time in Leipzig from 1723 to 1750. And as far as I recall, there are no duplicates. There are just 10 random texts that happen to survive. Every once in a while, a new one will show up hidden in a library somewhere. This one, represented here in facsimile, covers the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th Sundays after Trinity and St. Michael's Day, 1724. So as one pages through it, you will see the texts in liturgical order of those cantatas, beginning, in fact, with the 13th Sunday after Trinity and the text of our piece. It was very gratifying, I think, to the people who worked out on the basis of detailed study of Bach's manuscripts and sources, who worked out what must have been the original dates of performance. It was very gratifying to them, I am sure, when this booklet turned up a number of years ago, exactly confirming what had been worked out from source stories. Ours, as I said, opens with the text for the 13th Sunday after Trinity, and it says, after the date, it says, at St. Thomas. And then right after it, after all the movements of the cantata, is a piece for the 14th Sunday after Trinity. It's Jesu meine Seele, cantata 78 that we heard last season, in fact. And it says, at St. Nicholas. There were two principal churches in Leipzig, and usually the most elaborate church music, that is, the music typically composed by and performed under Bach's direction, alternated between the two. But if you go to the very back of the booklet, to St. Michael's Day, which was a very high feast, It says, early in the morning at St. Thomas and in the afternoon at St. Nicholas. This was performed at both places, but otherwise, to the rest of the book, these alternate for the most solemn occasions at both. So there were 5 texts in this booklet, and that has some really interesting implications. It shows, first of all, that there was comprehensive planning. Now, we knew that already for the chorale cantata cycle because they're so systematic in the way it puts together its librettos. But this wasn't just going cantata by cantata. There was a systematic plan on the part of the librettist, the composer, and presumably the church authorities too, on what was going to be heard in the churches. Now, of course, this booklet covering 5 or 6 dates had to be printed before the first date, so before the 13th Sunday, had to be ready in time for the 13th Sunday after Trinity, even though it covers 5 weeks after that. It seems likely, from what we can tell, though, that Bach was not 5 or 6 weeks ahead in his composing. Now, if you think about it, though, that means in his first years in Leipzig, when he was composing, say, at least the subsequent pieces, he might well have been doing it with a copy of this printed text on his desk in front of him. And a booklet like this may have been in the hands of his copyists who copied out parts, we'll get to that in a minute, which might help explain what particular text they knew to copy out for a given piece. It also means that Bach might have been living with upcoming texts, having read through them, studied, thought about them, maybe even planning movements in his head. Bach famously disdained those who needed to sit at a keyboard to compose. Klavierritter, he called them, sort of knights of the keyboard, that couldn't do anything but be stuck on the keyboard there. So one can imagine that Bach might have been sort of drafting pieces and coming up with ideas for movements in his head for the pieces in the later on in these booklets. It might also help explain some of the miraculous surety with which Bach wrote down even brand new pieces on a blank piece of music paper. The texts are headed by their movement type. It says chorale, or it says recitative, or it says aria, and each of those 3 kinds of text are distinguished by their typeface and how they're indented on the page. You can even just see from there that there's lots of variety in the way that's typeset. It corresponds to the various types of text. I spent a lot of time in here emphasizing how important it is to understand what kind of text Bach is setting. Is it scriptural prose? Is it a chorale? Is it chorale poetry? Is it recitative poetry? Is it aria poetry? They apparently thought it was really important too, and it signaled in all kinds of ways. So, with the text in hand, the next step, of course, is Bach's composition of a cantata. Bach composes directly onto the page, very, very rarely makes any kind of sketch or draft. He's writing directly onto the page, starting with blank paper that he then ruled by hand. Here's an example of a page like that, ruled by hand, with a 5-nibbed pen that he would drag across the page. The only parallel, it's called a rostrum or a rostral, and the only parallel tool I know that some of you might remember is the device that holds 5 pieces of chalk when you want to put a staff line on a blank blackboard. Same thing, right? So he ruled staff lines. He committed 1 piece of paper at a time in composing. So this is a facsimile of his composing score of our piece, and it's written on 5 sheets of paper. A sheet of paper at the time was about this big, so this was a pretty standard size, and he would fold, after ruling it, he would then fold it over once, and it gave him 1, 2, 3, 4 sides to compose on before he'd pick up the next piece of paper and go on. He tended to commit only 1 piece of paper at a time when he was composing. There were lots of reasons for that. One was if things got screwed up so badly, or the ink was too, if he changed his mind completely about a movement, the most you'd ever have to recopy is what fit on 1 page. Doesn't happen very often, but that's how he worked his way through. So he did that until he got to the very last piece of paper he needed, with the last few movements on it, and then the last movement ends with some blank staves at the bottom, because that's all there was, and the back page, which was already ruled, is unused, is not written with music. We can tell from various kinds of evidence that Bach composed movements in order. New movements start immediately after the after the conclusion of the previous movement. Some composers writing other kinds of pieces will start a new piece of paper or a new gathering of pages for new movements. Opera composers do this all the time as you're shuffling numbers around in opera, but that's not how Bach worked. He worked his way from beginning to end, presumably with some kind of compositional plan that we simply don't have access to anymore. This score is in his fast, messy, composing handwriting, and you can compare it to the calligraphic handwriting that he would use when he was making a fresh copy, a so-called fair copy of a piece whose notes already existed, that he was simply recopying. You will recognize the calligraphic fair copy hand of Bach from numerous tote bags, neckties, and all the handkerchiefs and all the places that show you Bach's handwriting. They never give you his composing handwriting. It's not as beautiful. There are many abbreviated notations in a score. The Aria number 3, for example, doesn't label its staffs, doesn't tell you what instruments play them, but its clefs do. There are 2 clefs typically used by violin, followed by 1 typically used by viola. That has to be violin 1, violin 2, viola. That's just understood. The voice part isn't labeled either, but in Bach's time there were 4 different clefs, the symbols at the beginning of the staff, telling you where the note names are, and there were 4 different clefs used for the 4 different voices. So it begins with alto clef, so it must be in Leipzig anyway, it must be an alto part. There are other places where you can't always count on that. The bass clef is used at the very bottom, and that's the basso continuo line. So none of that is specified, but it would have been understood as a way to read that score. Number 5, the next to last movement, says aria for 2 oboes. Just for clarity, strings were really the default instruments. It's understood to be a string piece unless you're told something else. It says for 2 oboes. The vocal lines are also unlabeled, but it's tenor and bass clef, so it's unambiguous. The final chorale, movement number 6, is interesting in the way it is notated. That's here. I doubt you can see the detail, but it's just the 4 vocal lines and the bass line, unlabeled, again, unambiguous because of their clefs, but only 1 phrase of the text is written in. The text isn't there, and that's going to have implications for when people are, Bach's assistants are asked to copy out parts, because the singers have to know what to sing. But Bach didn't feel it necessary to write that text in, and there's some other things he didn't feel necessary to write in as well, that we'll come back to. That notation of the chorale leaves a lot unsaid on the page. So once Bach was done composing and had a finished score, then came, to my mind, a really interesting part, realizing a performance of that piece. And Bach did that. Bach specified the parameters of the performance he wanted by having his assistants copy out vocal and instrumental parts from the score. Remember, the score is the only notation of this piece that exists anywhere in the world. And those sets of parts look something like this. This is a wrapper. Again, this is facsimile, of course. This is a facsimile, represents the wrapper that's from slightly after Bach's time. And what's inside of it, and would have been inside of it, is a set of performing parts that was distributed to the vocalists and the instrumentalists. These are in Leipzig now. These took an interesting path, but they remained in Leipzig. And they were handed out to the vocalists and the instrumentalists. And even without my being there, I can guarantee you they were collected again. How do I know that they were collected again every time? We still have them. Right? This represented valuable repertory that was going to be reused and reused. It represented expert copying labor. It represented expensive paper and ink. This was not something that you just let people take home to practice. It simply wasn't what was done. You weren't even allowed to market it, as far as we can tell. Just now, as I said before, you'll probably get thrown out of a modern rehearsal if you show up without a pencil, right? It was kind of the opposite then. It was not your place to mark up parts. Right. So, it's the copying of these parts and the way those determine a performance that represent the mechanism by which Bach explained, dictated how a performance would go. So, the assignment of lines, the clarification of abbreviated notation in the composing score, the number of performers that he expected to have perform the piece. Now, this last point is the most complicated. I'm just going to tell you in the shortest possible way that it really does seem as if Bach's practice was to have one physical part, one thing that could be handed for each player or singer in the piece. That parts were not shared in the way that, say, violinists might share a part now and stand part on the stand. I don't have time to demonstrate that to you. I just want you to know that this is the premise that Bach seems to operate on. If you want to talk sometime about how we know that, we'll do it. It's a matter of reverse engineering how the parts were designed to be used. And you say, yeah, that makes sense if this was one performing part per person. So what do we have for our cantata, Cantata 33? To start with, we have 4 vocal parts: soprano, alto, tenore, basso, labeled that. And each one is its own part that would have been handed to a singer in that range. Note that these are parts. They are not vocal scored. I have the soprano part here, and it contains just the soprano line. It's not a modern vocal score. And think about it for a minute. That makes sense. This is just like the part that you might hand a violinist, right? Or an oboist, or the cellist, or the violone player. And it makes sense because these had to be copied by hand. And it would have been an enormous amount of labor, not to say the amount of paper it would take, to provide every singer with the notes of all the 3 other parts that they don't need. It's not their job to sing them. So singers had been used to for a long time and were accustomed in Bach's time to singing from parts. And so each of these has only the soprano, alto, tenor, or bass line in it. As a singer, you just count measures the way a violinist would, and then when you get to the end of number of measures rest indicated, then you start singing. That's all. Okay, so the soprano. Soprano is on half a sheet, right, or one sheet. Originally, this was one of those big folded sheets, and it takes only the front. The back is unnotated. There's some, after 300 years, some of the ink has bled through, right, so you can see some of it. But only the front is there, and what's in the soprano part? It's just the opening chorus, where the soprano sings the chorale line, and the closing chorale, where the soprano once again sings the chorale melody, and it says otherwise, recit and aria tacit, recit and aria tacit, meaning while other people are performing a recitative and an aria, you remain quiet, and then the same thing again. That got tucked in at the bottom, the person didn't put it in and then went back and put it. This has just the music that the soprano needs to perform the piece. Here's the alto part. It takes the front, the back, and the front of 3 pages, right? And so it's done as a little booklet, and the back is once again ruled but unused. What's in there? Well, it says recit and aria tacit, numbers 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, and the only other things in here are the things the alto sings. In the first movement, the aria for alto, and then the closing chorale. Why are those movements in there? Because that's what the alto has to sing. Why are the other ones not in there? Because the alto doesn't participate in those. And you might notice that this one, I'm going to come back to this, opens like a little booklet. You read from that page, and then you read the 2 inner pages. And if this piece were longer, you then read on the back page. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. Here's the tenor. It also takes a double sheet. It's got the opening movement, the aria number 3, and the closing chorale, and tacit markings in all the other movements. The tacit markings are there, of course, so the singer can stay oriented, knowing where are we in the piece. Always useful to know. Sometimes it'll even say something more helpful like aria alto tacit, so you're really sure where you are. Again, opens like a little booklet, and then here's the bass part, works the same way. Opening movement, the recit number 2, the duet number 5, that was in the tenor also, and then the closing chorale, once again, opens like a little booklet. The chorale has the entire text in each of the soprano, alto, and tenor bass parts, provided by the copyist, but remember that wasn't in the score. I think what was going on was that the copyist probably had one of these in front of him, or maybe a hymnal if it wasn't available for some reason, but wasn't taking that from Bach's score. Needed instructions from Bach, say, make sure you take the text out of for that last movement from this sheet. Okay, then of course there are instrumental parts, and they look almost the same. They contain, for example, here's oboe 1. It's got the movements that oboe play. No, it's a double sheet. So there's the opening movements, then recit and aria tacit, recit tacit, and then an aria, that's the duet aria for bass and tenor, and then the concluding chorale. Now, there's all kinds of interesting things to say about that. First of all, you might notice that the way the paper is used is different from the vocal parts. That's the first page, and that's the second page. And that's the third and fourth pages. That's different from the way the vocal parts work, where that was 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not hard to work out why, right? Page turns, right? I mean, the first movement fits on this page, it fits right on the stand. You don't have to do any page turns. And then between movements, when you've got 3 tacit movements, you turn the page over. Right? So this is for the oboe as it happens. It's a different way of using paper. Vocalists, of course, can hold the page with 2 hands and have their hands free and can turn the pages. The other thing is, of course, that the final chorale is in here. His instruction that the oboe is to double the soprano in playing that line. That's not in the score. That was a Leipzig convention. That was part of the instructions that Bach gave. When you copy the oboe 1 part, include the soprano line of the chorale. If we had just Bach's composing score and didn't know his usual Leipzig practice, we simply wouldn't know that. Here's oboe 2. And I'm sorry to say, oboe 10 looks very much like oboe 1, except I think, as occasionally happened, the copy of Forgot began on this page, and so there's a terrible page turn that says, Verticito, turn the page quick. So the tempo, rest, rest, play, right? Sorry, oboe 2. But then, the chorale, there's plenty of time to turn the page up and do it for the chorale. But this looks just like oboe 1. And in here, for the final chorale, is the alto line of the 4-part chorale. Bach had to have instructed his copyists to put the alto line in there. Here's first violin. Again, laid out the sensible way for an instrumentalist, right? And violin 2, same way. All these instrumental parts, by the way, say at the top, besides the name of the part, violino secundo, this says, it also says, Allein zu dir, Herr Jesu Christ, the title of the piece. And if you think about it for a minute, none of the vocal parts say that across the head. If you think about it, that's in case this falls on the floor and somebody picks it up and says, what cantata is this to? The vocal parts have the text in it, right? But these don't. So these are always labeled with the part in case one of them escapes. Here's the viola part, again labeled and laid out so that you, nope, this is a verticito also, but there are no rests. Yeah, well no, there's a quarter rest. Okay, you have a viola, you have a quarter rest to turn the page where Victoria says. What else do we have? So all of these parts, so far, are in the hand of one of Bach's principal copyists, Johann Andreas Kuhnau. He was the nephew of Johann Kuhnau, Bach's predecessor as Thomas Cantor. He was an expert copyist, and Bach trusted him to make a full set of parts. He also copied this part, labeled Continuo. So it's here, and then the first movement is on this page, and subsequent movements are here, and then here. It takes up a good bit more paper than the other parts, and that kind of makes sense because basso continuo plays in every movement, right? So these parts that we are seeing, one each of the vocal parts, one each of violin 1, violin 2, viola, whatever, woodwind, and continuo, represent a typical set of Bach parts with one addition that Bach and his copyists always make, and that's this. It's another part marked continuo. But this one is different in that it has so-called figures. It has numbers written over the notes that indicate what counterpoint and what harmony you play with your right hand. The organist plays the continuo, keyboard continuo player will play the bass line with their left hand and then improvise harmony and counterpoint over it with their right hand, and that figure guides them. And this part has figures, these indications all the way through, but there's a catch about this part. Whereas all the other parts are notated beginning in A minor, this part is actually in G minor. It's a step lower. And that, as I've mentioned a couple of times in here, is because there were 2 different tuning systems in use at the time. 2 different ideas about what constituted A. And there was a long, long tradition of having organs and other church-led instruments tuned to a much higher pitch. In fact, a whole step higher than the woodwind instruments that eventually get combined. Strings and voices can tune to either pitch standard, but the practice in Leipzig was to tune everybody to the lower woodwind pitch and then make it possible for the organ to play along by copying out a part transposed down a step so that the higher pitch will bring it back up to where everybody else is, right? So there's always a transposed part. This one just says continuo, but you know it has to be an organ part because of its pitch. Now that represents most of the parts that you will expect to find in a Bach cantata set, but it's not complete. We know that there were actually a few more parts. So I've already shown you 4 vocal parts, violin 1, violin 2, viola, 2 oboe parts, and 2 continuo parts. 1 just playing at the pitch everybody else is playing at, and 1 for organ. Bach also always had a junior copyist make duplicate parts. A second copy of violin 1, a second copy of violin 2, and a second plain continuo part. So a complete set was what I outlined, except that there's 2 copies of violin 1, 2 copies of violin 2, and 2 melodic continuo parts. And that pattern is repeated over and over and over again for Bach's church music performances, and lots of others as well. What does that tell us? Well, at the very least, Bach counted on at least 2 violins on each of the lines, and at least 2 players on the continuo line, 2 melodic instrument players. By the principle I told you that we think it's 1 part per player, that means 2 first violins, 2 second violins. That's what we're doing here. And 1 viola, 1 cello, and 1 violone, 1 double bass on the continuo, plus keyboard instrument. Now, from that first set of parts, it's pretty clear that the keyboard instrument in 1724 was organ. But there's a catch. There's always a catch. For a later performance in the 1730s, following a pattern you see with a bunch of pieces Bach reperformed, Bach took one of those plain continuo parts and added keyboard figures for a few of the movements. And in this case, it's the recitative, the alto aria, and the recitative that follows. Now, it's now a keyboard part at the lower woodwind pitch, so it's not an organ part, and it's pretty clear that what it was a harpsichord part. So it's pretty clear that sometime in the 1730s, and then he wrote in the organ part, tacit over those movements. So when you got to those movements, it's pretty clear that organ dropped out and harpsichord played. Bach is differentiating the accompaniment, and it's especially exquisite in this piece because the harpsichord sound goes along with the plucked strings, that both bass line and upper strings that support that beautiful violin 1 note. Right? So the 2 recitatives and that alto aria. Organ drops out. Okay, here's the question. Here's the puzzle. When Bach did that, so organ in the outer movements, harpsichord in the middle, did the harpsichord remain silent in the outer movements, or was it both organ and harpsichord together, so-called dual accompaniment? Now, we could talk all day about that. I happen not to be a strong believer at all in dual accompaniment. I think what happened is Bach is differentiating between organ continuo and harpsichord continuo. And although that wasn't done in the 1724 performance, I thought it really would be exquisite to get a chance to hear it. So we're jumping ahead to the 1730s and doing a version of this piece that differentiates the 2 keyboard continuo instruments. So, can all of this that I've now told you affect the way you listen to the piece? I think so. You can listen, especially for things we know from the parts, that a score, which survived for this piece, but is incomplete in what it tells us, doesn't let us know. You can listen for the use of double violins in violin 1 and violin 2, especially in the opening movement, where you have that soloistic line that Bach actually almost certainly intended to be played by 2 violins. I know the duplicate violin 1 part doesn't exist. Ask me afterwards how I'm pretty sure that he had 2 violins on that line. You can listen for the doubling of voices by all the instruments in the final chorale. You can listen for the realization of continuo with cello and violone and 1 keyboard instrument. That's not something the score tells you, that's something the parts tell you. You can listen for the differentiated use of organ and harpsichord, as I mentioned in the performance we're emulating, not something in the score reflected only in the parts. You can listen for the overall disposition of 4 voices and 11 instruments. And you can listen in general for a performance as the product of a process of the invention of the text, of the composition of the piece, of the copying and realization of the piece by the copying of parts, and then finally the singing and playing from those parts. And I want to suggest that we should probably all recognize that every performance of any kind of piece is a realization of a score. Now, we have chosen to follow Bach's model here in performing a cantata. That's what we do here. But every performance of any kind of piece does that. And I suggest you can always listen for that when you hear a piece. Thanks.
willst du mich auf den Gesetzte fragen, so kann ich nicht, weil mein Gewissen widerspricht, auf 1001 sagen, an Seelenkräften arm und an der Liebe bloß, und meine Sünd ist schwer und übergroß, doch weil sie mich von Herzen reue, wirst du, mein Gott und Ort, durch ein Vergebungswort mich wieder
close by